Bridges, Richmond Hill.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to have the opportunity to speak to such an important motion today. I'd like to start by actually giving what the motion that the opposition is putting forward. That given the Prime Minister's comments of Wednesday, February 20th, 2019, that the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights is the appropriate place for Canadians to get answers on this SNC-Lavalin affair. And given his alleged direct involvement in a sustained effort to influence SNC-Lavalin's criminal prosecution, the House order the Prime Minister to appear, testify, and answer questions at the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights under oath for a televised 2-hour meeting before Friday, March 15th, 2019. Now, Madam Speaker, I had a town hall in my riding of Aurora Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill on yesterday, and it was on taxes, tariffs, and trade. But what most of my constituents actually wanted to talk about, we had a good discussion on taxes, tariffs, and trade, but what they really wanted to know was what is the SNC-Lavalin affair, and perhaps more importantly, Mr. Speaker, why it matters. It's a highly complicated and confusing and a lot of different information around it. So the question is, what exactly is it and why does it matter? First and foremost, it is not about SNC-Lavalin. It is not about jobs. It's actually specifically about the coordinated, unsolicited, and sustained pressure on the former Attorney General to politically interfere and overturn a decision by the Director of Public Prosecutions to proceed with the prosecution of fraud and bribery charges of SNC-Lavalin. Now, that's quite complicated, but what it's more importantly about is what is this pattern of behavior from the government, the Prime Minister, his staff, ministers, cabinet, and in general, undermining the democratic institutions at the very core of our rules-based order and who we are as Canadians. So let's talk about that for a little bit. The executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch are critically important pillars of our democracy. They're structured in such a way as to be independent and somewhat separate from each other because they act as checks and balances on each other. And then within the executive branch, that is Cabinet and the Prime Minister, they have specific responsibilities as well, not the least of which is to not politically interfere in a judicial system and to protect and preserve the independence of that judicial system. Why is that important? Because ultimately, our democracy and rules-based order is dependent on each and every citizen, company, organization being equal in the eyes of the law and justice being blind to their race, ethnicity, creed, location, language, whatever it is. And secondly, those decisions must be made with only the law in mind, not with political interference. So in this case, we're looking at a Prime Minister that had a pattern of inappropriate and possibly illegal behavior. First of all, he says that the former Attorney General has the authority to make these decisions on her own because they are her decisions and her decisions alone. Well, there's an issue with that, Madam Speaker, because I'm sure you'll appreciate that I, as a mother, when I tell my son that I want him to do the dishes and I ask him to do the dishes, and it's his decision whether or not he does the dishes or not, it's actually not really his decision. Whereas, because I have a certain amount of authority, or I like to think that I do, over my son. Whereas if my daughter, who is younger than my son, were to ask him to help her with something, it truly, in fact, would be her decision. So when the Prime Minister asks the former Attorney General to do something, it absolutely is pressure, because as we can see, she decided not to take the course of action that he was recommending. And as a result, he put even increased pressure on her after that decision was made. And in the end, she actually was removed from her position. And one has to ask if someone else was put in her place to do what she would not. Now, the other key thing here is that the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, while they may physically be in the same individual, they are two separate and distinct responsibilities. So that Cabinet and the Clerk of the Privy Council and even the PMO, under our rules and regulations and our laws, have the ability to advise and support the Minister of Justice, but they don't have that same privilege for the Attorney General, because the Attorney General is acting as a capacity of that judicial system, which is separate. So to confuse those two further undermines. So one has to ask, what was the responsibility of the PMO and Gerald Butts and others in that when they're having meetings with the former Attorney General to apply pressure at the Chateau Laurier? One does also have to ask why at the Chateau Laurier. It's not a normal operation of business. We have offices here in the House of Commons and in other government buildings around the town, so we should be having those meetings there. And then, of course, the clerk. The clerk of the Privy Council has a responsibility to advise and support the execution of the machinery of the executive branch, not to advise the Attorney General on legal matters. So every time we undermine the three important aspects of democracy, that's truly what's at stake in this conversation. The rule of law and our democracy are incredibly important, and that's why we're here to talk about it today. To say this motion of getting to the truth is to score partisan and political points is absolutely to grossly misrepresent the severity of this conversation. Each and every one of us, as members of Parliament or as ministers in the executive branch, have sworn an oath to this country and to the Queen to uphold the democracy in the nature that it's in. If we can't rely on members of Parliament to be above partisan policy when the very nature of our democracy is at stake, then what is the value of being in this House? If we won't stand up to protect and preserve and defend our democracy, and in so doing, ensure that individuals holding important positions in the executive branch are not held accountable in accordance with our laws, then who will? And so that's why this motion is so incredibly important. We must get to the truth. We must ensure that the very nature of our democracy is preserved, and we must find a way to have the courage on both sides of the House to remember that we are serving Canadians first. We are paid by Canadians, not by a political party, and we are here to deliver for Canadians not only a government agenda, but also the very nature and fabric of our democracy. That, Mr. Speaker, is what's at stake in the SNC-Lavalin case. It's not about jobs. It's not about SNC-Lavalin. It's about whether or not the structure and responsibilities of the individuals in this institution are upholding their responsibility. And this motion is critically important to be able to get to that. So I hope that all in this House will support this motion to protect, defend, and preserve our democracy. Thank you.
Comments, questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Louis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member began her intervention by saying that the rule of law somehow was not being properly defended or was somehow being threatened by this situation. But Mr. Wernick, in his very powerful testimony, opened by saying, should Canadians be concerned about the rule of law in this country? No. In the matter of SNC-Lavalin, it is now 7 years since the first police raid on the company, 4 years since charges were laid by the RCMP, and during the entire time and up to today, the independence of the investigative and prosecutorial function has never been compromised. Now, Mr. Wernick is an exceptional public servant, so exceptional, in fact, that he served under Prime Minister Harper. That means Prime Minister Harper had confidence in Michael Wernick. He had confidence in his judgment. He had confidence in his integrity. But then all of a sudden, Mr. Wernick says a truth that isn't the truth of the opposition, and we hear calls of partisanship. Why are we changing our view based on what the opposition wants to hear, not on what is the truth?
For Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a very, very important question, because ultimately we have to ask ourselves, is the clerk of the Privy Council the keeper of the rules-based order in Canada? And so therefore, is he, in his capacity as clerk, the authority to speak on that matter? I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that that is not the clerk of the Privy Council's role or responsibility. He is there to support the government agenda, the Prime Minister, the ministers and cabinet, as the senior bureaucrat, the senior deliverer of the machinery of the executive branch. He is in no way the legal authority to determine whether or not there has been interference, political interference in the rule of law, and whether or not it has been carried out in its capacity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member in her speech talked a lot about the institution and the various different institutions that we have to keep and hold various different people accountable. And she talked very eloquently about it, and I would not disagree that what she had to say in terms of how those institutions are to be represented and the authority that they have. But the thing is, Mr. Speaker, there are two institutions that are currently undergoing using two different processes to get and to look into these particular questions. Those are the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights that's currently holding hearings, as we know, while at the same time the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner is conducting an investigation. So why is it, given her position on how important these institutions are, why is it that the opposition does not seem to trust that these institutions can provide Canadians with the answers that they're looking for? Great question.
Good question.
Honourable member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm excited to be able to answer that for the simple reason that that is a representation of the confusion around this. The Ethics Commissioner has responsibility for ethics, not for political interference, not whether or not the former Attorney General was influenced in any way. We also have a Food and Drug Administration, but we're not getting them involved in this issue either because it's not their responsibility and authority to investigate this nature. Now, when he speaks to the Judicial and Human Rights Committee, that's a fundamentally different thing. So yes, that committee is reviewing this matter, but we're not going to hear from one of the key people if this motion, this Opposition Day motion, is not passed, because the Prime Minister is a key witness. And so how can an investigative committee actually do their real work if they don't get to hear from the people that they need to hear from to be able to hear the entire truth? So absolutely, if they are saying that the Judicial Committee is the place for this to be investigated, then we need to hear from all of the people implicated in this case. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I